Are you ready to learn about one of the world's most deadly poisons? Join me today and we will talk about my friend Castor. So today we are talking about another one of the world's famous or infamous poison plants, and I'd like to introduce you to the castor oil plant, sometimes known as castor bean or Palmist Christi, which it gets that name because the leaves look like the palm of a hand. So castor is Ricinus communis, and it got the name Ricinus because Dioscorides thought that it looked like, the seeds anyway, looked like a tick. And now in modern times we actually have a tick called the castor bean or castor plant tick, so kind of comes full circle. When Linnaeus was naming things, he thought, you know what, that's a pretty good description of the seeds, and so the name stuck as the genus. And this plant is the only member of its genus, which is also something that makes it very, very special. And of course, communis, that just means it's super common, and it is indeed very common. Here where I'm standing, you can see I'm in almost like a little, actually this is a little exotic invasive forest here. We've got castor bean growing up over me, we have guinea grass around me, and there's even some Caesar weed poking out there as well too. So it turns out it's not native to the state of Florida. It is actually an exotic invasive, and you can see what that means, where it does tend to take over an area. But it is a plant of the tropics, the sunny places in the world. So originally from Africa, India, and the Middle East, it has since been taken all over the world, and you can find it pretty much anywhere.
So how do we know that it's castor? Well, one of the easiest ways is by checking out the leaves. You can see here that it is palmate, which means that it is almost like the palm of your hand with fingers coming off of it. You can see these little leaf bits come off almost like fingers. And it reminds me a little bit of cannabis, but one of the ways that I tell that it is not that plant is because it does have this more of like a webbing in between the leaf lobes as well. Another really good clue that it is castor oil plant or castor bean are these fruits. Now these will pop open and have the famous seeds in them, and we'll show you that in a little bit later. But the fruit are almost like little rubbery three-lobed globes, and they have little spikes on them. Now the spikes aren't sharp, they are more rubbery, but when you see a plant that has these ball-shaped seed pods on it that look rounded and spiky, but it's not just one, and there's multiple coming off of a stalk like this with the palmate leaves, that is a good indication that you are working with castor. You can also see that a lot of times it has flowers along with the seeds, and we'll show you that a little bit later on. But when you're looking at the stalks of the leaves themselves, they're also purple to red in color, which is another good clue as well. The castor plant has both male and female flowers growing on the stalk. So if you are super lucky, you may actually be able to see both of these flowers on the plant before it goes to seed. Although usually when we see the plant and we really recognize it, it's when it has those very clearly identifiable globe-like seed pods.
So castor bean is the name that I know this plant by, but it turns out it's not a bean. The beans and the peas are in the Legumiaceae or the Fabaceae family, and this beautiful creature is actually in Euphorbiaceae. So if you've seen my video on Manchineel, which is kind of infamous as the world's most deadliest tree, castor is in the same family, which is interesting to know that one of the plants that's considered one of the most toxic is also in that, or toxic is in that same family. So not a bean or a pea like we would eat, but that doesn't mean that this plant hasn't had a long history of having working with humans and being useful for humans. In fact, we have some of the earliest evidence for the use of this plant by humans coming out of Egypt. We have papyrus from 1530 BCE that states that this plant is wonderful, the oil from it, to use for a lamp oil, and it's great for issues with the eyes. We have historical evidence that it was used in ancient Greek, ancient Rome, and really that area that we talked about it coming from, Ayurvedic medicine, from historical times to today, it is a plant that is deeply respected for its medicinal value. It has a lot of use for us as well as, just believe it or not, in our everyday lives. We have over 700 different industrial uses for this plant. It is used in manufacturing, everything from soap to paint to even being included in things like food additives, and it's being grown in Brazil right now as a biodiesel fuel. So this plant gets a really bad rap for being deadly toxic, and also from a lot of land managers for being an exotic invasive, which you can see it's kind of doing here now. But it's a great example of just because it may not be super great in one area doesn't mean that it has zero value, and also doesn't mean that it's not a plant that we can work with, because it turns out we've been using castor since the earliest of times, and even today it shows up in our daily lives as well. You may have heard that one of the legendary historical uses for castor oil was as a lubricant in airplanes, and it is true. In World War I especially, it was the oil that was used to run the engines of the airplanes that were just making their appearances in the war. There are a lot of stories about pilots being around the oil and then having problems with diarrhea and other issues, and that's kind of up for debate. Some people think it is absolutely true, and other people say that could have also have been nerves. But what is not out of question is whether or not the oil from this plant is a great lubricant, because it absolutely is. Now, I want to be really clear that castor oil that you might buy for using in your home or as medicine does not have any of the toxins from the seed, or at least it shouldn't. So it's really important to understand that the toxins are removed when you do get that oil to use it medicinally, or when it's used as, for instance, a food additive or something else that we might be ingesting. So about that ingestion of the oil, let's be super clear, it does not taste good. And I think that's one of the reasons why people don't really use it very much. You don't hear about it being used a lot internally, but in the 50s and 60s, it was pretty normal to have a tablespoon or a teaspoon of castor oil every week to help kind of clear everything out. Now, I'm not advocating that, because it is quite the purgative, which means it can be used as a laxative to help you clean everything out. But it is actually really great for as an anti-inflammatory and as an analgesic. It heals skin, and it is renowned for its ability to repair tissue, which is really interesting because one of the poisonous properties of this plant is it's renowned for being able to destroy tissue, to destroy the cells. So this is a great example of a plant whose poison actually has almost a complete mirror in its ability to help us. So it's used a lot in different types of herbal medicine. For instance, Ayurvedic. One of the ways that we can work with this plant and receive its medicine is by helping to improve our skin. It's really lovely to help heal skin, especially scars and old wounds. It's also gotten really kind of famous lately in the past couple years for helping to regenerate hair and help with hair growth, and also to just kind of repair a lot of the problems that we have from our skin from sun damage and other toxins in the environment. Now, that famous castor oil is high in omega-3s and vitamin E's, which is one of the reasons why it's super great for skin. It also has a lot of advocated use for pain. So things like arthritis, even menstrual cramps, and just any kind of muscle soreness, you can find castor packs that are made with the oil to put on those areas along with some warmth to help alleviate that as well. And again, I just really want to stress that this isn't new medicine to us. This is medicine that comes to us from multiple different countries: Egypt, India, Greece, Italy, like all over the world. It's come to us as medicine from the ages, and it's still a beautiful plant to work with today. I'm holding in my hands one of the castor plant's fruit. So like a lot of plants in Euphorbiaceae, which again is that spurge family with poinsettia and manchineel and some of the other actually pretty well-known poisonous plants, they usually have these fruits that have little lobes in them. And so as it dries, they separate out. And this one is, sorry, oh, wow. I don't know if you just saw that, but it actually just exploded open. And that's kind of one of the things that can happen with these seeds. They have so much energy in them that when they finally dry out, they burst open. And each one of these lobes does have a seed in it. And you can really see that it gets its name, ricinus, from these seeds that look just like ticks, but like, aren't they gorgeous? It's really, really hard not to be absolutely just enthralled with these patterns. And I'm not the first person to feel that way. They actually have been used in jewelry, especially during Victorian times, all the way up into the 70s and 80s. They were used as jewelry, which seems like a terrible idea, but it turns out that as long as you don't break the seed coat, the deadly poison that's inside of them will not affect you. However, I do recommend being very careful. Certainly do not go out and harvest these. Do not try to eat them or anything else, but just take my word for it that these guys are pretty safe if you do not break the coat. And again, they are commonly sold in different gardening stores. You can even get them on mail order catalogs, because there are different cultivars that have really beautiful red and purple seeds that are pretty famous and sought out after all over the world. But again, I'm being very, very careful with these seeds. I've got to make sure that I wash my hands really, really well. Actually, as soon as we turn off the camera, I have stuff to clean my hands just to be on the safe side. All right, so I am standing inside pretty much of several castor plants, and you can see they get pretty big. They can get as tall as 13 feet or even a little bit taller. I am a pretty tiny Misha. I'm about 5'3", so these beautiful allies are pretty darn big, and I am surrounded by pollinators. I have a bee buzzing around me right now. I've seen some wasps out here and some butterflies, so there's actually quite a few pollinators that come service these plants as well. Which brings me back to that place of like, so should we fear it? Well, it turns out it is considered to be one of the strongest plant poisons. So let's talk about that. The chemical in the plant that does all the damage is in the seed. So what's really unique is that it's not your typical plant chemical compound, or not your typical poison. It's actually a protein, and those are pretty rare in the world of the plant poisons. In fact, the other one that's the one in castor that's famous is, of course, ricin, and we'll talk a little bit about that famous story in just a moment. But the other one that's very famous is abrin, which is in rosary pea, a true member of the pea family, and we'll meet that guy a little later on. But back to that ricin. So it's a lectin, which is a type of protein, and you know, like I said, it's pretty rare in the plant family. However, there are some lectins that we eat. So things like red kidney beans, they have lectins in it, but that particular one is not as powerful as the one that we have in our castor plant or in our rosary pea. And in that case, in the case of the kidney bean, you can cook it really, really well, like boil it, drain off the water, and then it's safe to eat. That is not the case with this guy. You definitely do not want to eat it. So why? Well, the lectin in this one has two distinct chains that can affect and actually destroy our cells. So earlier I was talking about how the oil, which has been processed to remove the lectin and the toxic chemicals, can help repair our growth, because the plant does have the ability to do that with its toxin. It has the ability to destroy our cells and actually just cause them to completely die. It does that because it has two different chains, a haptomer and effector, and the first one attaches to the cell and opens it up so that the molecule can get inside. And once it does, the effector turns on and it can actually shut off the ribosomes in our cells. And that's crazy, because it can turn off as many as 1,500 in 1 minute or less than 1 minute. And that totally, absolutely leads to cell failure and death. What's particularly dangerous is most of the time when we have castor seed problems or castor bean problems, it's because people have eaten them. Whether it is accidental or purposeful, because there have definitely been cases of people mistaking this as a food source. They come out and they see like all of these pods and think, hey, this must be good to eat. Again, don't do it. It's not. One of the reasons why we teach you why I want to make sure you know the ID is so that you know what not to put in your mouth. And really, you should never put a plant in your mouth unless you're 100,000% sure you know what it is. But the cases of poisoning that we have, it's the digestive tract that gets affected. So that seed is taken in, the seed coat is broken, that lectin and the chemicals get into our system and immediately start destroying our cells. Once a causes the harm to the digestive system, and it's brutal. We have vomiting, you get nausea, we even have destruction to the lining of the digestive system. Then it gets into the circulatory system, it's carried throughout the body and causes all sorts of problems, including hemorrhage and organ failure. So those are the kind of the scarier side of the plant's poison, and it is pretty frightening. But you can see, like, I would not be doing this if it was dangerous for me to be standing here. I'm a risky girl and I like adventure, but not to that level. So I really want people to understand that even though something has some really scary parts of it, that doesn't mean that it needs to be feared. You certainly don't need to live in fear of this plant or feel like it's out to get you. And in fact, the most famous case of an incident with the ricin happened in 1978. It happened to a Bulgarian defector named Grigory Markov, and he was assassinated in London on the Waterloo Bridge. Now, the famous part of this story, it was right out of a spy novel. Legend has it that someone came up to him and bumped him, and they were carrying an umbrella. And the person said, "Oh, excuse me," and continued on his way. And later that night, next day, Mr. Markov wasn't feeling so good, and within a week, he was dead. He had passed on. When an autopsy was done, they found a strange little pellet inside of his body. And later on, it was like a little tiny, I think it was the head of a pin pellet, and it had traces of ricin on it. Later on, there was a umbrella that was found. They said the man that bumped into him was carrying an umbrella, and a similar one was found from something that had happened with another Bulgarian defector 10 days earlier. And it appeared as though that umbrella was used to inject a tiny little capsule into the body. Now, if that's true, if it was only about the size of the head of a pin and it came from this plant, the ricin, that definitely means that it's pretty darn strong. And to this day, we'll never really know if the chemical compound was just extracted from this plant or included something else, but we can be certain that the toxins from this plant are extremely strong and they should not be messed with. The good news is that even though different government agencies, including the UK, pulled the seeds off the market in 2005 because there was a concern that people might be able to extract the ricin from it, it's actually super difficult to do. It's really hard to make the oil from it. It's not an easy process, even though we've been doing it for hundreds of years. It can be done, but it's not necessarily something that you can do in an hour in your backyard. And the chemicals from it are even harder to isolate. So again, if in order to have harm caused to you by this plant, you really have to be trying hard, and you really have to be mindfully doing something that will ingest it into your body. So it's a great example of a plant that has so much history of working with humans and helping us, and one that we can respect and understand could potentially hurt us, but we can still use as very strong medicine.